Hiya, I'm Emma Norry. I write under the name of Norry and sometimes Em Norry. Um, but you can call me Em, and I'm fine to be known as Em. And I'm a writer for children. So I'm here today to have a bit of a chat and share some of my experience about writing a first draft. So it's really exciting if you've decided you're going to enter this competition. It sounds brilliant, and picture books and short chapter books are such a great things to write. Lots of fun. And the main thing I would say for a first draft, in my experience, is just get the thing written. So, you've come up with your idea and it's just a case of getting the words down. Now, some of you may plan your books and some of you may not. I've done a bit of both. So with my first published book, Son of the Circus, I had a bit of a plan, really rough plan, because otherwise I lose inspiration. So I worked out the word count, and I knew roughly how many chapters there were going to be. So if some of you are writing the short chapter books, that might help for you. If you know it needs to be 10 to 15,000 words, and you know that the chapters are going to be, 800 words or 1,000 words, then you might work out how many chapters you've got, and you can write your first draft by tackling a chapter at a time. Whether or not you write in order, in sequence, is entirely up to you. Sometimes for a first draft, it really is just a case of get the words down, because once you've got them down, that whole dirty draft idea, once those words are down, then you can go back and edit them and rewrite them and refine them. But you can't edit a blank piece of paper. It's one of my favourite sayings. So definitely get your words down first if you can. It's very likely that once you've finished your first draft and you've written down the story, that things will change hugely, not only in the editing and rewriting, but sometimes when you've got the whole shape of a story and you realise, the ups and downs and what the characters have gone through, then where you thought the beginning was, what you thought the start might be, can actually change. Quite often in a first draft, we start the story we're not getting in there right into the action. We might start with a bit more kind of introduction stuff, or a lot of information that can go in the backstory, or that we don't actually need to know, because we need something interesting and sort of something to hook us in the first chapter. So I wouldn't necessarily get fixed on rewriting or editing as you go along. I certainly don't. If I did that, then I would never get anything written. So with Son of the Circus, I had a bit of a plan. I literally wrote down the numbers 1 to 20 on a piece of paper, and wrote down roughly what was going to happen, like one line, and then I was off. That would give me something to start with when I sat down for each writing session. A first draft isn't going onto Twitter or checking Facebook or doing another bit of research. A first draft really is just writing the story. What can be quite useful sometimes, if you haven't written before, or if you haven't written for a while, or this is a new genre for you to write, it can really help just to write out as if you're telling someone the story. So literally just write it all as tell. One day there was a boy called Bob, and Bob and his 5 brothers and sisters decided to go on an adventure to a magical land of, and just literally write it all down as tell, to get the sort of idea of the shape of the story as a whole. And sometimes if you do that, you can kind of get ideas along the way. And I would do that free writing, which is when you don't really have a plan. You may be, you might want to set a timer. Sometimes setting a timer for 15 minutes is a really good length of time. It's not so short that you feel like you can't get started. And you turn off your phone, set a kitchen timer or an alarm, and literally write down your story, tell yourself the story in 15 minutes and see what you come out with. You can write quite a lot in 15 minutes, or type. But I did write my first book without any plan and just wrote it, and literally just wrote it as I said that to you, I kind of told myself the story. And I do think that is definitely a way of doing it. So I definitely think getting the words down is the most important thing. It doesn't have to be an amazing plan, doesn't have to all be plotted out, but you just need to know the characters and know what's going to happen, and at least be, have the shape of a beginning, middle and end, I think. If you're finding it hard to write, if you're finding it hard to find the time, because, it can be if you've got caring responsibilities or a lack of time, or like many of us, you work a day job, try and remember or try and work out when your best time of day is. Some of us can only write after finishing work at 5 or finishing work at 9 after putting the kids to bed, or, we might be able to get up a little bit earlier, maybe even 15, 20 minutes and do that, sort of that free writing exercise about, what else do I want to include in my story, or how could that conversation go between those characters? I definitely believe that little and often keeps the story alive in your mind and keeps the characters alive in your mind. When I wrote my first book, I only had weekends to write, and I would literally go out of the house to a cafe back in the days when they were open, and I would, nurse a coffee for too many hours, and just I took pen and paper, because I found it easier to kind of doodle and not get distracted by looking at the internet. So I hand wrote everything, and I would just sort of spend a bit of time, telling myself the story, or adding bits of backstory, bits of conversation. I don't think a first draft has to be written in order. It doesn't have to be, this is what happened and then that happened. I do think if you ever get stuck, which happens to all of us, I think, taking something big and dramatic from one of the characters' lives can really unblock things. So, what is my character scared of? What was their best experience ever? What is their favourite possession? If they had 3 wishes, what would they wish? And you can sort of get more and more story ideas like that. Once you've finished your first draft, one of the most important things, I think, absolutely, is letting it sit. So, letting it rest and giving yourself some time away from it. At least a week if you can. And then when you come to read it again, this is almost impossible for every writer I know. So there's lots of advice out there. And one bit of advice is try and read it through without making any corrections. I find that really hard. And I will always read things through with a pen in my hand, but I'm learning to try to not to do that, just to try and read it through. Maybe get yourself some post-it notes or a highlighter, but without stopping and editing as you go along. If you just underline something, maybe red for something that works really well, that you love, that you definitely want to keep, and in a different colour, blue or black, for something that, might need work. You might need more explanation or more description, or you notice you've had 3 pages of description and no one's talked. That kind of thing. Definitely print it out, because our brains just work totally differently reading something on paper. It's much easier to spot mistakes, especially things like repetition, than scrolling through a screen. I would definitely advise on that. And if you can, and if you're happy to share your work, then definitely go for someone for some feedback. Because when it's our story, we're really close to it. If it's something, whether it's something we've just come up with or something that we've been thinking about writing for a long time, we're sort of so close to it, we might not be able to see the good or the bad about that particular story. Especially if you've put your heart and soul into everything. So it can help to get someone to read it who maybe doesn't know you. So if you want to share it with friends and family, then that's great. But the chances are they will like it and they will want to make you feel good, and they may not be able to give you the constructive criticism that you need to make your story better. So there's lots of writing organisations out there. There's the Society of Children's Book Writers. There's Write Mentor on Twitter. There is Author Mentor Match on Twitter, and some of those. There's Writing Community on Twitter, hashtags people to find critique partners. And if someone isn't willing to read the whole thing, because it's quite a big ask for someone, you might want to reach out on social media or to any writers groups and suggest you both swap the beginnings or a couple of chapters and see what you think. Yeah, it's working with other writers is a there's a big writing community out there, and people are so kind and generous with their time and very helpful. But the main things is try and get it all down in one go. If you need to do research, if you're doing kind of historical, my book that's out in April is I had to do loads of research on spy gadgets and MI5 and MI6, but when I needed to not interrupt the flow, when I needed to research something, I literally would just put research gadgets in brackets and then carry on. And with Son of the Circus, it was, research how people took down a circus tent in 18 whenever, and I would literally just make a note. Because if you interrupt your flow, sometimes it's really hard to come back to it. So with the first draft, I would definitely keep going if you can. And best of luck. Best of luck. Your stories need to be told, and children are dying to read them. Good luck.